What's up, Summer Shade? It's Mr. Jonathan here, back in my Summer Shade Science Lab. I'm so glad that you're here today because I have an awesome experiment that shows just how amazing science can be. You know, science and chemistry are always at work around us every day in our lives, and sometimes we don't even notice it. Sometimes it's in really small ways, but sometimes it's in explosive, big ways. So I have an experiment today that's going to show you just how explosive and reactive science can be. The name of today's experiment is called elephant toothpaste, and that's because, well, I won't tell you just yet. I'll just let you see for yourself and you can figure out why it's called that. So you know that as scientists, we are always questioning and wondering why things do the things that they do, and we want to know how things work because we're curious. So sometimes to understand big things, we have to shrink down and look at the small things because those can be the most powerful sometimes. So let's take a look at what's going on in our reaction today so it can better help us understand what we see as a result. So let's check it out and see what's going on. So to understand what's happening in our experiment today, let's review real quick what goes into it. So we know that H2O, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, gives you liquid water. So we talked about hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2, and it has 2 hydrogens and 2 oxygens. So the addition of 1 extra oxygen molecule gives you hydrogen peroxide. So now let's introduce a new ingredient. So you may have heard of this one before. It's something called yeast. So yeast is very important and very useful because it is actually what gives us bread. So yeast and heat are used together to make bread rise and bake to give us the delicious bread that we love to eat. So yeast is a single-celled organism and it is a member of the fungus kingdom. I know it doesn't sound very appetizing eating a fungus, but we would not have any of our delicious breads without it. So yeast is actually a living single-celled organism. So we know from our last experiment that most living cells produce an enzyme called catalase. So catalase is something that breaks down hydrogen peroxide. It's something called a catalyst. So a catalyst is something that speeds up a reaction. So hydrogen peroxide on its own breaks down into oxygen gas and water by itself, but the catalase produced by the cells make that reaction happen extremely fast. And that's how the cell defends itself from the toxic effects of hydrogen peroxide. So the catalase breaks down the hydrogen peroxide, which is H2O2, and turns it back into H2O, which is water, and oxygen gas. So now that we know what's going on in our experiment, let's take a look at the results and see just how amazing and explosive they can actually be. So let's check out what we need to see our experiment work. The first thing is yeast. So remember, yeast is our single-cell organism that is a member of the fungus family. Yeast comes in a little packet just like this, and remember, it's actually alive, and that's what enables it to be part of this reaction. So we have our yeast. The next thing we need is our hydrogen peroxide. So normally when you see hydrogen peroxide, it's in a little brown bottle that looks like this. But since we want to take this experiment up to the next level, we're going to use something a little bit stronger. So this is also hydrogen peroxide, except it's a much higher concentration. So our reaction will work with the 3% hydrogen peroxide, which is what is in this brown bottle, but this is 12% hydrogen peroxide. So and since this is more concentrated, we'll get a much more powerful and much more energetic reaction because there's more peroxide for the catalase in the yeast to react with. We're gonna need some food coloring and an empty 2-liter bottle. All right, so now that we have all our stuff, let's put it together and see what happens. Okay, so I have all of our stuff set up and ready for our experiment. So in my bottle right here, I have our hydrogen peroxide mixed with some food coloring, and I have our bottle taped down because this reaction might get a little crazy. And right here, I have our yeast. So remember, in this reaction, the yeast, which is a living organism, produces an enzyme called catalase. So catalase is very efficient at breaking down the hydrogen peroxide into oxygen gas and into water. And this reaction happens very fast. So what we've also put in here is some liquid dish soap. So if you've ever washed dishes at your house, you know that your hands or your dishes can get really soapy. So the reason we put dish soap in the bottle is so it can capture the oxygen bubbles that's created when the hydrogen peroxide is being broken apart. And that'll help us to see just how much gas is produced during this reaction. Another thing that you won't be able to see is the heat that is produced. So this reaction is something called an exothermic reaction. So what that means is it produces heat as a byproduct. So this reaction is so powerful, it can actually get up to where it's hot enough to boil water and burn you. So after this experiment, it's important not to touch it right away because it'll be so hot from the reaction that it can actually burn you. Alright, so we have our safety glasses on and our gloves. We are ready to check out and see the power of hydrogen peroxide and yeast. So what you see here is all of that oxygen gas being released from the hydrogen peroxide, and the dish soap is able to catch the bubbles so we can see just how much of it forms. Isn't it crazy how fast all that gas was formed in just a split second? That just shows how powerful the enzyme catalase is inside the yeast at breaking down the hydrogen peroxide. So remember, it has this enzyme to protect it from the hydrogen peroxide so the cell will not die. So the catalase has to be really good at what it does. And because it is, it gives us this awesome experiment. And the reason it's called elephant toothpaste, if you haven't already figured it out, is because we have this big bottle and all this stuff that looks like nice foamy toothpaste, and it's big enough that it would work for an elephant. Alright, so I hope you guys enjoyed this chemistry science experiment. Remember to keep on exploring and being curious and trying to figure out new ways that things work. Alright, so I'll catch you guys later. Bye!
Hey, thanks for watching.
Make sure to subscribe to all our channels. Bye!